Dear Rector Yves Flückiger, dear colleagues, dear guests, dear Professor Esther Duflo. On behalf of the Geneva School of Economics and Management at the University of Geneva, I'm delighted to welcome you to the Luigi Solari Lecture 2023. Since 1979, the University of Geneva has been organizing an annual public lecture in memory of Professor Luigi Solari, who was a pioneer in introducing research in econometrics in Switzerland. As a professor at the University of Geneva from 1964, he was the first to teach this discipline in Switzerland. In 1966, he created a research center for econometrics, which later became the Department of Econometrics at the Faculty of Economics and Social Sciences, and then the Institute of Economics and Econometrics at the Geneva School of Economics and Management. When Professor Solari suddenly passed away in 1977, Nobel laureate Professor Sir Richard Stone wrote in a tribute to him, Professor Solari had a passion for economics and for making it a reliable, practical tool. Since its first edition in 1979, the Luigi Solari Lecture has featured many distinguished speakers, including Nobel laureates Bengt Holmström, Jan Tinbergen, Richard Stone, Robert Engel, and Jean Tirole. This year, we have the special honor to welcome Professor Esther Duflo to the Luigi Solari Lecture. Esther Duflo is the Abdul Latif Jameel Professor of Poverty Alleviation and Development Economics in the Department of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a co-founder and co-director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab called GPAL. In 2019, she received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, awarded jointly with Abhijit Banerjee and Michael Kramer for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. Professor Duflo will speak about good economics for warmer times, a topic that is not only highly relevant and extremely timely, but also fits perfectly to our school's mission to educate responsible leaders and to have a positive impact on society. Dear Professor Duflo, we are extremely excited that you joined us for giving this year's Solari Lecture. We are very much looking forward to your lecture. Before giving the floor to you, I'm delighted to ask our university's rector, Professor Yves Flückiger, to come on stage. Thank you.
Madame la vice-rectrice, Monsieur le doyen, Madame Esther Duflo, prix Nobel d'économie 2019, chers collègues, chers amis de la faculté d'économie et de management, au nom de l'Université de Genève, bienvenue à cette conférence Solari. C'est pour moi un immense plaisir de pouvoir ouvrir ce soir cette conférence. C'est un honneur, c'est un privilège d'avoir Esther Duflo avec nous ce soir pour une conférence qui va tous nous et toutes nous passionner. Demain, elle va recevoir un doctorat honoris causa de l'Université de Genève. Ce n'est pas toutes les années que nous avons le privilège de recevoir comme DHC une lauréate du prix Nobel. Je note par ailleurs que l'année dernière, nous avions donné un doctorat honoris causa à une femme qui est devenue prix Nobel de médecine cette année, Madame Clara Fanico. Donc il y a peut-être un lien de causalité, et peut-être que le DHC de demain vont devenir des prix Nobel d'après-demain. Madame Esther Duflo, vous aurez l'occasion de l'observer, a donné ses lettres de noblesse à l'économie. Une économie incarnée, une économie orientée vers des solutions, une économie qui se veut avoir un impact sociétal, et je crois que ça correspond à nos missions, à nos valeurs, les valeurs de l'Université de Genève, et je sais que ces missions sont aussi très largement partagées par tous les collègues de la faculté d'économie et de management, et je les en remercie. Sans plus tarder, je passe la parole au professeur Giorgio Di Giorgi, qui va vous présenter la conférence de ce soir. Merci infiniment de votre présence et peut-être à demain pour le Dies Academicus de l'Université de Genève. Merci beaucoup.
I just want to thank Esther for coming over. I know it's been a difficult trip, so a couple of times. So thank you so much for coming over. This is a very special occasion for us in general because, of course, it's the Solari Lecture. We do this with great passion, And I also want to thank the organizing team who has done a lot of work here, so this should be recognized. Also, somewhat beautiful this year, one of our students, Federica Braccioli, won the Young Economist Award, the European Economic Association, so congratulations to Federica. I know you're somewhere there. I know Esther cares a lot about her students, so we're talking about students before. And I also know that essentially all of you are waiting for Esther to talk, so I'm just going to get going. Thank you, Esther, again. Please, all yours.
Monsieur le recteur, Madame la vice-rectrice, Monsieur le doyen, Giacomo, chers amis, chers collègues, chers étudiants, merci d'être ici. Je dois vous dire que je suis complètement aveuglée par la lumière, donc si vous faites des grands signes ou des rictus, des feux, je ne vois rien. Néanmoins, let me start by joining my congratulations to Frederica. That's wonderful. I'm sure it's one of many. And it's great to see you recognized in this way. It's very fitting today that I want to talk about good economics for one more time, given that I arrived here expecting full, not having checked the weather report, and it's beautiful out, and there is a magnificent sun, and you can't help thinking that that's not quite right. In fact, the taxi driver on my way back from the airport, I told him, oh, what a beautiful weather, you know, small talk, and he said, yes, that's terrible. So I think this is really, we are getting a bit more consciousness on this issue, and it's high time. So what I want to talk to you about today is how this situation, what is happening to our planet, the warming that is happening to our planet, creates a responsibility of rich countries and rich citizens of rich countries in particular towards poor countries. That is so severe that is really high time that we do something about it. It kind of goes in three steps. The first one is that it is, I think, widely recognized that the change in the climate is human-caused, and that the historical emissions of richer countries along the path of industrialization are responsible for the stock of carbon in the atmosphere, and therefore the warming, because what matters is not just the flux, but the entire stock. So I don't think there is much question about that. But it is also the case that it is very, very difficult to get richer countries to admit the principle that they should pay for their past mistakes, be it slavery, colonization, or climate change. Is kind of a non-starter as a political argument. And then often you hear, well, you know, historically, yes, true, but now you look at India, you look at China, they are countries that are doing a ton of emissions, and they are not really going very, very fast in the path to transition. So this is really what in Europe is doing what they can, what we can. In Europe, we are doing what we can. So now it's really about India and China and the US to some extent to take over. But in fact, this really isn't that perception that, oh, it used to be us, but now it's us plus China and India, is not entirely accurate, because the emissions that are produced in China and India are in large part produced in order to produce goods that are then consumed in Europe and the US. So if we're looking at, when we are trying to measure a carbon footprint of an individual, the measure that is kind of the basic measure is production emissions, so it's point of use emissions. So imagine you drive your electric car to go somewhere. Your emission by this first measure are nothing, because you don't emit anything by driving your electric car. by a second measure, including electricity use, depending how clean the electricity you're using for the car, there's a second measure of emission. But then there is a third measure, which is what went into the production of that car. Typically, this emission is not going to take place in the construction of the car is not taking place in Switzerland. It's taking place in Korea, or it's taking place in China, or it's in various bits and pieces are assembled. And therefore, if we go by measure 1 or 2, by driving my electric car, I don't contribute much to 1 and 2, but by measure 3, I should attribute back all of the things that went into building that car. And in fact, it is pretty polluting to build an electric car. In fact, if you take into account the battery and so on, and the material that goes into the battery, the production of the electric car is very polluting. So what really should matter is not measure 1 or 2, is measure 3, to get a full carbon footprint of every single individual. So the problem is that, so here's an example of, here's an illustration of why it matters. This is basically a graphical illustration of what I was just saying. In the US, people are, the measure 3 tends to be larger than measure 1 and 2. That is, if we're looking at trade flow, the US imports a lot of emission. And meanwhile, China and India export a lot of emission equivalent, because a lot of what is being produced in China is actually exported in the rest of the world. Europe, like the US, is more of an importer. So the question is, so this is measured from, this is calculated using trade flows, but the question then is, are you able to measure, to compute this, this full value of someone's carbon footprint? So it's of course very, very difficult to do it at the individual level, or even at the country level, because we don't know. You would have to accumulate everything that everyone consumes. So you need to make some assumptions, and then with some assumptions, you can do it at the level at the distributional level. So this is something that Lucas Chancel does, and in parallel with different assumptions, a team led by Bruckner at the World Bank. And what they do is, in several steps, they first use consumption survey data to estimate the elasticity of emission with respect to income, so how much your emission increase with respect to your income. And you find an elasticity of about 0.5. That means not 0.5 or 0.5, which means that as people consume more, they don't emit proportionally more, but about half. So because when you're very poor, you need heat to heat your home and so on. So there is a lot of energy need at the beginning. As you become richer, you start having consumption that is less polluting by unit, but you also have much more consumption. So the elasticity is 0.5. Now what you can do, and this is you get from survey data and combined with input-output measures of trade. Then what you can do is to combine that with survey data on global distribution of revenues to compute the global distribution of carbon footprints. So Lucas Chancel, for example, does that using the data from the World Inequality Lab at the Paris School of Economics. And when you do that, you can now calculate, how much emission the top 1% of emitters are responsible for, how much emission are responsible for the bottom, etc. And what you're seeing is that, of course, the top 1% of emitter emit much more than the bottom 50%. So the top 1% of emitter emit about 100 times, a little less than 100 times more than the bottom 50% of emitter. If we group people by share, we get a rule that is very simple to remember. The bottom 50% of emitter of CO2 emit about 10% of a global emission, and the top 10% of emitter emit about 50% of global emission. So it's a 10-50 rules, and it works both ways. It didn't have to. It's not mechanical that it works both ways. But that way, you just have to remember one thing. It's a 10-50 rule. The 10% bottom emitter are responsible for, the 10% top emitters are responsible for 50% of the emission, and the 10% and the 50% lowest emitter are responsible for 10% of the world emission. When you put all of that together, you can see that because people in richer countries are richer, and there are more rich people in rich countries, and rich people who are richer consume more and therefore emit more. The high polluter, the high emitter mainly live in rich countries. So this is actually data from Bruckner, but he comes, as I said, very similar to the Chancel conclusion. So you can see that all of Africa is either gray because there is no data, or blue because emission is very, very low. And then Europe is kind of orange, and the US is being dark red. In the recent past as well, between 1990 and 2029, the growth of emission is concentrated at the top. So the top 1% of emitters are responsible for 23% of the emission growth. And the entire bottom 50% is responsible for 16% of emission growth. This is kind of the rise of emerging country, to rich people in China and India and so on, or people becoming poorer in China and India. Meanwhile, in kind of the middle class of rich countries emits less because it consumes less, and also because the emission becomes the consumption becomes cleaner. What this means is that there really is no trade-off between eradicating poverty and saving the planet, because poor people are responsible for so little of the global emission that you can make them a little less poor, and it's kind of going to hardly register. So according to Bruckner, this is impact from getting various fulfilling various global development goals. So if we could eliminate completely extreme poverty, that's the first global development goal of eliminating the number of people living today under $2 a day, it would increase global emission by about 2%. So this would kind of hardly register if we eliminated global poverty entirely. So that's the first point. Really, not in the past, but today. So forgetting you don't want to be responsible for the sins of your ancestor, that's okay. But if we're looking at today's behavior, the rich people, and in particular rich people in rich countries are responsible for climate change. There's very little that poor people can do because they are contributing nothing to the problem. The second point is that the cost, however, and in particular the human cost, are going to be felt in the poorer part of the world mainly. It's not to say that you're not going to experience cost in Switzerland. Glaciers melting and all that, that's going to change the mountain, and it's going to change nature, and it's going to change people's livelihood, etc. But if we are talking about life and death, which is the biggest way in which we should evaluate the cost, then the sad truth is that that's going to be, the hurt is really going to be in the poor countries. Why is that? Well, first of all, it's because they are in places that are already warm today. So this is the temperature today. It's kind of a heat map of the temperature, in that's the heat map of the number of days above 32 degrees centigrade, which become very difficult for human life, particularly when it's humid. And you can see that, of course, there are many more of those days in the Sahel region in Africa, in South Asia, in the north of Latin America, and in Central America, and anywhere else. And it turns out, of course, these are places where a lot of poor people live. Now, since these places are already hot, as the planet warms, it doesn't warm quite equally, but still, you get more extra hot days in places that already have hot days. So by 2050, you're seeing more extra hot days in the poor parts of the world, and by 2100, even more. I think this is a 2100. This is a 2050, but by 2100 even more. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the cost of a very hot day, in particular in terms of human lives, is not the same in every part of the globe. The reason being that when the day is very hot, you're not just sitting there and thinking, oh, it's very hot. You're doing something to adjust to it. So if you're living in Texas, if the day is very hot, you crank up the air conditioning. And then you go in your air-conditioned car to your air-conditioned office, and you do your job there. So the probability that you die there is kind of very low. The only thing that could happen to you, even if it gets very, very hot, is some people who are homeless, people who are very, very disadvantaged. Now, it's very hot in Pakistan, and you live in a rural area in Pakistan, there is no air conditioning in your house. There is no car that you have to take to go to your job. You're working often outside in the field or in construction and so on. And so you're much more subject to the elements. So taking this kind of idea in a more systematic way, you can see that, so this is data coming from the Global Impact Lab, Global Climate Impact Lab at the University of Chicago, led by Michael Greenstone and with Tama Carlton as a key collaborator. And what they did is that they have a bunch of micro area in the world, like tens of thousands of micro regions, so sub-national units, a little bit all over the world. And they have historical data both on mortality and on weather. And what you can see is, if there are more days relative to the usual, to the normal of 20 degrees, or to the kind of a basic of 20 degrees, centigrade. If you have more days that are 30, 35, 40, or on the other opposite, 15, 10, etc., minus 5, do you get more death in these particular regions compared to other regions where it turns out that that particular year it wasn't that hot? So the climate is slowly changing, but even within a given climate, there are year-to-year variation in weather that are kind of similar to random that we can exploit to answer these questions. So basically, you're comparing the same region in a hot year compared to a cool year, comparing to another similar region where it wasn't that hot in that particular day. So that takes into account everything that's specific about the region, everything that's specific about the year, looking at deviation from the normal weather pattern. So this is something that Michael Greenstone had pioneered for the US. And what we're seeing is that, so this does this for various types of microregion, some that are cold, temperate, or hot, and some that have high income, middle income, low income. And what each of these graphs is telling you is, do you have a lot of excess mortality when it's particularly hot compared to days at 20 degrees? And what you can see from this graph is very simple. Is if you look at the high-income regions, it's really only in the places that are cold that you get a little bit of excess mortality in high-income region. That's because they are not very used to the fact that it's hot. So for example, the first time we had a heat wave in France, a decade ago now, 2 decades ago, actually, people were so unused to it that a lot of old people died in the house because nobody was thinking of checking on them. And in subsequent heat wave, that wasn't the case because people could get used to prepared. So there is something about getting used to a particular pattern, to have adjusted to it. But the second thing you see is that conditional on the usual type of climate you have, the poorer you are, and the more an extra day is costly in terms of death. So you can see it here, that the cold countries who are also poor have huge excess mortality, the highest of all of the graph. The middle-income country, which have also the poorest one get the highest one. And even among the countries that are hot, the poorest country get a lot of excess mortality. When there are more days, every time there are very hot days. So if you put all of this together for all of the microregions they have and you extrapolate to the ones they don't have, you get this map, which is what's the mortality rate for an extra day at 35 degrees relative to the reference temperature for the regions, expressed in death per 100,000. And what you're seeing is that, okay, in Russia, if you have many days above 35 degrees, a lot of people will die. In Siberia and all that. Well, because Siberia is poor and it's cold. But there are not going to be very many days above 35 degrees in Siberia. And then, of course, you have like all of Africa being extremely red here, and the northern part of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh being very red as well. When you combine the two and two together, which is those places that are poor today will get more hot days, and those hot days will cause more death, you get this map, which is the mortality effect of climate change in 2100 under kind of the high emission, if we continue, one of the climate modeling, if we continue with what we have. And what you're seeing is that actually in part of Europe, including the northern France and actually Switzerland and the UK, in terms of death, there are going to be fewer deaths due to climate change than there are today. The reason being the winters are going to be milder, and a lot of people die in very cold winter. So it's not, I don't want you to get away from this room saying, oh, fine, climate change is not a problem for us. There's going to be a lot of other problems, but mortality is not going to be one of them. Now, if you're in, all of this Sahel region in Africa, by the way, where you're seeing now coups and problems and all that, it's very red. They are going to experience the highest cost for climate change. Somalia, Pakistan, and so on. Overall, the calculation that the Chicago lab find is that so of course there is a lot of uncertainty around this. So this graph kind of gives you both what we expect in terms of average mortality, excess mortality, plus the variability around it. So depending on the different simulation of climate scenarios. Overall, on average, what they estimate is that temperature alone by 2100 under the current scenario would cause 73 extra deaths per 100,000. As you might think, that's not that much, but it is more than all of the deaths from infectious diseases today. So imagine, finding great medical advance to cure tuberculosis and HIV and the future COVID and so on. That would be less gain than the loss we would get from just the temperature. And this is not even including, floods and that type of thing. It's just the extra temperature. And all of these deaths, as the map makes pretty clear, will take place outside the OECD. So it's entirely a cost that we impose to the rest of the world. So this makes it for a very thorny political issue because, first order, in the next many years, the problems are in the South or in low-income countries today, but the principal margin of actions are in the North because this is where the emission takes place. So this is can we say that we've experienced, that we've displayed a great capacity to deal with this? And I would say no. We had a great sort of rehearsal of a problem that originates not in Africa, it was in the North, it was China, but then it very quickly moved to Italy and becomes kind of a worldwide rich country problem. It wasn't even so much of a poor country problem. There wasn't that many deaths from COVID in Africa, but the economic kind of slowdown was for everyone. So you would think that would kind of be a good setup where, oh, there is this problem, that's a worldwide problem that affects all the countries, including poor countries. Are we doing something to help out? And we didn't. Maybe we have already forgotten that, so it's good to remind ourselves. But one of the things that very early in the pandemic, Abdul Banerjee and I called for, which is a sort of Marshall Plan for poor countries to help them catch up, kind of keep their economies going and be able to quickly take off once COVID was better. This is basically what the rich countries did for themselves, but that they didn't do for poor countries. if we take the sum total of everything that resources countries were able to raise plus what they were given, in the rich countries, in the rich part of the world, countries spend about 27% of their budget in fiscal stimulus measures during COVID. So allowing people to remain in their job in Europe, or a generous unemployment insurance in the US, and so on. So that's 27%, that's all the green regions. In the poorest country, in the low-income countries, it was 2% of their GDP that were spent in fiscal stimulus measures during COVID. It's 2% of a much, much, much lower GDP. So it would really have taken nothing, really a rounding error of the trillions that we were raising for supporting our own economy to support a country like Togo or Benin at that level. But there was no kind of even any serious effort to do this, either during COVID or even just after. The result is that when all of the richer economy kind of very quickly took off after COVID, that really didn't happen in poor countries, which still expect basically zero or negative growth today. The second thing, of course, that is perhaps most even more well known is the problem of vaccines. Once we had the vaccines, we had plenty of them, it would have been an excellent opportunity to demonstrate our ability to work together as one world to solve a common problem, which would have been a good dress rehearsal for climate, which is work together as one world to solve a common problem. Except vaccines are so much easier. There is really nothing we need to do. We don't need to change our behavior and so on. We just need to share vaccines and ship them. And again, you know, in this, we made the argument just before a G8 summit, and that this was such a good moment to demonstrate the ability of rich countries to work together towards a common good. And that at that famous summit, like nothing happened. So during the vaccine distribution, there was really a deafening silence in terms of the ability to help the poor countries, and they heard it. They really definitely heard it. That means that any future cooperation is much more difficult now. We've seen it, for example, with kind of the lack of enthusiasm towards Ukraine in African countries, and we are going to, we're starting to see it as well in the climate conversation. So where are we, kind of after many COP in the climate front? Somewhat unfair characterization. So there is not enough money flowing towards a low and middle income country. The Copenhagen COP, which was in general not a good COP, still had the idea of 100 billion being sent to developing countries every year. This didn't happen. It was never fulfilled. Even the little money that was sent is usually for mitigation, so basically helping solving the problem, not helping adapting to it. And in the form of loans and private sector and so on. So even whatever was sent was really not little. In the COP27, there was a conceptual advance, which is the idea of a reparation fund, but no money was put into it whatsoever. That's a bit of a problem. So what does this, where does this leave us? Before moving to kind of a proposal, I'll make 2 points. The first one is that we cannot tackle climate change without tackling redistribution across countries. Why is that? Well, that's because of what I showed you about income being such a good protection against climate change, against warming. So if a country like India feels like nobody's going to help them protect their population when it gets very hot, what India wants to do is to get rich as quickly as possible, to get as much energy as they need as quickly as possible, in order to, to come up with the energy that they need to give. Here is a graph of how much countries. So again, a kind of a simulation is saying how much countries will need to spend in extra energy to protect their citizens. So as country, one way in which you adapt, like the key way in which you adapt is really energy spending, because that's air conditioning. So the countries that can afford it will kind of crank up the air conditioning and spend more and more energy. And you're seeing a tremendous increase in the energy needs of China and India, which expect a 150% increase in energy need. Of course, the blue bar represents what fraction of the world energy is consumed there. But you see the huge increase in energy in India and then in Nigeria, 2,000%. So the estimated energy needs will increase. If there is no other way to protect your citizen, you're just going to go for the cheapest energy possible. And that means, for example, for India, coal. So at the last, not the Sharm el-Sheikh COP, but the Glasgow COP, the world had the impression, or the Western power thought that India would sign on a pledge to renege on, to win itself on coal, and it didn't. At the very end, it was like, finally, I'm not signing it. And people really complained about it, but the truth is that they made the point, which is perhaps a reasonable point, which is, hey, well, we need to find a way to allow energy access for our citizens, given climate change. So other ways to do adaptation is critical to get mitigation. Otherwise, people are going to look for the fastest way to protect themselves, which are not necessarily the best way from the Earth perspective. The second point is that you cannot tackle climate change without tackling redistribution within countries. Why is that? Because any effective climate change measures require some redistribution, winners and losers. For example, if you want to get rid of very, very polluting cars, that's good for the planet, but the people who are driving the polluting car, that's bad for them, objectively. And they're not going to like to do that unless they know that they can be compensated for that gesture. So in France, there was this very kind of big social protest movement a few years ago now. And people may have forgotten, but it really started as an anti-climate movement. What provoked it was an attempt to introduce a carbon tax, in particular on gasoline. And people refused that. They very, very quickly abandoned the tax, but people continue to complain. And what this T-shirt says is, actually, a lot of you are French, so you can read it. But basically, money for climate change is not in the pocket of the proletariat, it's in the fiscal paradise. And it's really making the point that people felt that something like a carbon tax or removing the old vehicle from the road and stuff like that is a way of making the incidence of the fight against climate change beyond the poor. Whereas, in fact, in principle, it could have been redistributed away, but they didn't trust it was going to happen, partly because, just a few months before, we had gotten rid of the wealth tax. So they maybe had a reason to think that it was not the way the chips were about to fall. Similarly, in India, there are some things that are happening that are terribly inefficient for the planet, not just long-term, but even current local environment. One of them is free electricity for farmers, which they use to pump water. In a place like Punjab, they've used it to pump so much water that there is very little water in the ground, and now it's actually become a problem. Even though the water is free, it's scarce, and it's very precious, but they're kind of stuck there because government after government in Punjab have tried and fallen on the attempt to start paying farmers, to start making farmers pay for electricity. And of course, the idea is always, you pay for electricity, but we give you a lump sum. And the farmers not really believe it, like midsummer madness is what they think about it, because they don't have the trust that that redistribution will take place. So for them, it's a way of taking surplus away from them and giving it to someone else. So when we take all of this into account, it becomes essential, in my opinion, to commit now to a true mechanism to raise money for a fund like the loss and damage fund. I don't want to invent a new money, which would be exclusively designed for low-income countries. And the system must be fair, both nationally and internationally. It must be permanent, and ideally would also provide some incentives along the way, so have a little bit of flavor of carbon tax, but not in a way that's going to upset the poor. So what I want to do in sort of the 10 minutes I have left is to give you three things about this this money. One is where you would, one suggestion for where you might raise it, actually a series of, so first how much we should raise, in my opinion. Second is where you might raise it. And third is how you might spend it. So how much you need? Well, we can go back to this extra mortality. And using a value of a statistical life, you can use the statistic, the extra mortality to put a kind of, compute just a little part of the social cost of a ton of carbon, which is the one due to mortality. So, in talking to Michael Greenstone, he's like, no, you shouldn't do that. You should take the entire social cost of a carbon, but I'm trying to be reasonable here. So I'm saying, okay, this is money that is going to go to poor countries. So let's take the part of the social cost of carbon that is entirely due to the fact that every ton of carbon I put in the atmosphere contributes to warming, which contributes to extra mortality. So you go back to these 73 extra deaths per 100,000. You value them at the value of a statistical life. You see, you crank up how much a cost of carbon costs. And you get this $37 of damage per ton just from loss of life, actually all of which will be in poor countries. Now you take the consumption emission calculated by our friends Chancel or Bruckner, they are the same, that's convenient. In the US and Europe combined, we get a total of about 40 billion tons per year, which amount to imposing an annual mortality cost of $518 billion for poor countries, make it 500. Just for comparison, the total foreign aid of the US is 56 billion. As you can see, these slides, once upon a time, were in French. So $56 billion. So we are not talking about like foreign aid here. The amount of money we're talking about are so much larger. So second step is, okay, how are you going to raise that money? It's a lot, $500 billion. I'm going to consider two scenarios. One is where we are actually serious about 500 billion. The other is where we try to do 100 billion, which is what was committed in COP. So a number of options have been discussed. There was a summit in Paris last June, and there was a document. It kind of came up with a number of ideas. A fossil fuel extraction levy, tax on carbon ticket, on a plane ticket, international shipping, windfall fossil fuel levy, and then other tax instruments not directly related to greenhouse gas, including a financial transaction tax or a tax on stock buyback. My proposal, and then there is a proposal that's not in here, which is a tax on very rich people, which Gabriel Zuckman is been working on. How much, just a tax on people who are on the 3,000 wealthier taxpayers in the world. My proposal is, which seems to be the more maybe the most realistic path to travel. Because there is already a discussion, in fact, more of a discussion agreement between a lot of countries on minimum taxation for international corporations. So this is shepherded by the OECD, and they arrived at a minimum corporate taxation for large corporations of about 15%. So everything's in place. My proposal is to add to that. And if you added to that, and you had no carve out, at $15 million, according to the EU Tax Observatory, which is led by Gabriel Zuckman, you get a base of 205 billion euros. If you add 3% to it, so you go to 18%, you can raise 300 billion euro. If you add 5% to it, you can raise 531 million to it. So go from 15% to 20%. And you are getting pretty close to what you need. And that is something that had been discussed. The original OECD plan was 25, and then it got moved down to 15. So the 15% have already been spent mentally by all of the countries, but this extra 10%, this extra 5%, sorry, have not yet been you know, no one has claimed them since they haven't been raised yet. So maybe it is possible to do that. So that's kind of, that was my suggestions. And then the last question is how to spend it. So Thomas Piketty, who has been talking about raising money to compensate poor countries, has a very simple proposal. You send it directly to the governments for them to do whatever it is they want to do with it. It's their money. I think that's a bit difficult to sell, probably. So for good and bad reasons. But another thing, so another extreme, which is maybe more the COP, the Sharm el-Sheikh system, is that, oh, there will be a fund and there'll be a bureaucracy to administer this fund, and countries won't have too much power on it. My proposal is to, somewhere in between, my proposal is to exploit the fact that there are now much more capacities in many countries to do transfer directly to poor people through their cell phones, for example. Togo did it during COVID. Through the financial banking system, India did it. India has a completely well-functioning financial infrastructure that reaches, you know, up to the very poorest. Where it doesn't exist, it can be built relatively simply. We know how to do it. So in principle, everybody is within reach of money going directly to their bank account. So a big part of this money could go straight to people who are victims of a climate event, either hot temperature or some other disruption. In fact, there was a recent experiment about doing it preventively. So there is an experiment in Bangladesh for kind of paying people in advance of a future flood, which helps people because we can now predict where these events are likely to be. So that helps people kind of prepare, move away, and so on. So a big part of the money could go there, straight to people via kind of rules that people would agree on, with almost no intermediation. That's a way of doing it quickly and efficiently. And we now have so much evidence from various cash transfer programs that people use the money well, that there wouldn't be an issue with that. Then you could have a part of the money helping kind of leapfrogging the bad technologies, so helping people develop clean electricity and so on, the right grid from the beginning so people are not stuck with their old systems in the past. And then there could be a third pillar that's about research, so improving the technologies we do have, both for mitigation and for adaptation. So you have now this investment funds, for example, the Fund for Innovation and Development in France, the Development Impact Venture in the US, which are basically encouraging very open proposals from everywhere in the world. You could have a large fund like a DIV fund, encouraging proposals from everyone, from field activists, etc., to improve either mitigation or adaptation or loss and recovery. So that's kind of how I would spend the money. So I'll stop here to say there is a margin for option, or there may be at least. Stay tuned for what we can do in the political process. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Esther, so much for this very insightful presentation. I think it was so clear, it's unbelievable almost. We'll take a few questions now from the audience. We'll try to sort of pinpoint people. So we'll take a battery maybe of 2 or 3 questions, maybe 3 questions at a time for the next 10 minutes or so. So if you have a question, raise your hand. There's going to be someone there. I think Morgan in the middle floor, if I can see it correctly, and Shuparna up there. So raise your hand if you want to ask a question to Esther. Not ideal.
Thanks, Professor Duflo, for the fantastic lecture. Now that the industrial policy is back in the topic, and the price of green technologies have been rapidly falling, especially solar at the lowest it has ever been, with the US going for a green industrial policy and industrial policy being a hot topic. Do you think the developing countries should also see industrial policies as a way to catch up, or will this also go along the lines that the richer countries will benefit from taking up industrial policies or not? Thanks.
Let's take 2 more questions, maybe. So we'll do a battery of 3.
My name is Constantino. I'm 14, and I study at the International School of Geneva. I just had a question for you. So in one of your first slides, you showed a percentage graph on carbon or on CO2 emissions on the middle class, poor class, and rich people. In your opinion, do you think the rich should be penalized for this?
So my question is, how are you going to ensure that the funding that shall be received to developing nations won't be picketed off by corruption?
Thank you. So industrial policy, so let me say, on the one hand, I have nothing against industrial policy. It's only in a world of perfect markets that industrial policy is not should not be done, and we don't live in perfect market world. There are network effects, etc. So there are reasons to try and do it. On the other hand, I think more broadly, I'm a little skeptical that technology is going to solve the problem. I think the climate change problem, even with the cost of renewable energy going down, as the cost of renewable, as the use of the non-renewable goes down, their price also goes down, and there is kind of a rat race between the two, and it becomes really valuable to continue to make sure that there are oil reserves and even coal reserves, and there's nothing that guarantees that the clean energy wins in this path. The industrial policy can help in pushing in one particular sector, and there is a hope that it will create sort of a virtuous circle, but we can't be convinced. So I think relying on technology alone for solving climate change is at best risky. That said, I think there is a lot that poorer countries can do to avoid doing a lot of very costly long-term investment they're going to be stuck to forever, because once you have a new coal plant, you really need to use it for a long time, otherwise you've lost a lot of money. And there, I think that's where being smart about where to invest, which would be AKA industrial policy, and potentially where the subsidies can go, which is why I would spend part of the money there, could help. On the fact that it's the rich people who are contributing most of the emission, I don't know if penalizing in the world is the word, but taxing, yes, for sure. Which is why, the instrument that I proposed of taxing the international corporation, in a sense, that goes in that direction, because the OECD agreement only taxed the very large, very wealthy corporations. So eventually that touches that. And I would also, if it were possible, very much support the Zuckman proposal of going after the 3,000 richer people. And I think he wants to, his proposal would be to tax them for 2% of their wealth every year, which is really very, very little, because they're probably making about 5% of their, minimum 5% of their wealth in returns. So if we tax 2% of the wealth, it's basically equivalent to taxing about a half on the revenue they're making for the wealth, which is really not that much. So I don't see it as a, I'm not a revolutionary, like by persuasion, but I don't see it as particularly egregious. I see it as a pretty normal taxation system that corresponds to, progressive taxation. The thing is, progressive taxation is carbon taxation, and we can, first order, and we can, since carbon taxation is such a difficult thing to implement, people are very against it, we can just forget about it for now and focus on progressive taxation. We'll go 90% of the way. On the, making sure that the money is not lost in corruption, first of all, that's a question which I think I always get, no matter what the topic is, there's always corruption. So let me remind you, because I always do that, there is plenty of corruption in rich countries, probably as much as there is in poor countries, at least in volume of money. So it cannot be, it really cannot be, should not be. And if you have to remember one thing from today, when you want to use corruption as an excuse for not doing something, just put this thought aside. In poor countries, put this thought aside for a moment, because that's just too easy an excuse. Number two, yes, I actually would worry, which is why I propose a system that's pretty. I wouldn't go the Thomas Piketty extreme of saying let's just give the money to the countries. It's not just corruption, but it's about how they choose to distribute it. In some countries, it might not go to some communities, it might not go to the poor, it might not go to the voiceless, and so on. So that's why I was proposing that a lot of that money goes straight to people via this bank account, where you need, in some sense, as long as countries agree to be part of the system, you need very, very little involvement of anybody once the pipelines exist. So that kind of solved that corruption issue in terms of getting money to people in the most efficient way possible.
I think we can take 3 more. Esther.
You did not mention degrowth. What is the economist's point of view on that? And do you really think we can get along without it?
Hi, Esther. I am a marketing professor from France, and I have a husband who is studying conflicts and poverty and development in the US. This is actually a combined question from both of us, him remotely. So it's also about distribution, and you said direct transfer to poor people in need, but we've also visited a lot of poor communities. A lot of them are not incorporated in formal economy, and not even their houses are registered, or where they live and how they can be contacted are not registered. So I guess maybe your case in Bangladesh can give us some insights into how to better incorporate marginalized and less connected people into a system where they can be taken care of. Thank you.
Another question somewhere?
Yeah, this was me. Thank you very much, Professor Duflo, for the lecture. I really liked what you said about the access to cheap energy and how it is going to be a game changer in the relations. I was wondering, what do you think about the regionalization approach? For instance, the EU takes it, because of course we cannot take Global South as one, let's say, put everything in the same bag. And for instance, we are hearing a lot between in terms of tensions between Southeast Asia and China. For instance, China is building huge dams on the Mekong River, basically depriving the population of the Southeast Asian region from water. So this is energy, water, but also conflict risk. How do you address this in your work, and what do you suggest as a remedy, especially in terms of regionalization approach? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So on degrowth, so I'm not a huge fan of growth, never have been, and I'm not a huge fan of degrowth either, for the same reason. I think in a sense that's kind of a little bit reductionist to try to flatten everything to one surface. If you take people in Mali, people in Mali need growth. They need, because so many people live under $2 a day, don't have access to the minimum things that they need to exist, and let alone to protect themselves from hot temperature. You can't tell Mali that they need to do degrowth. Not possible, in my opinion. On the other hand, growth per se has no reason to be the end all and be all of policy, and major policy mistakes have been made in rich countries, particularly on the altar of getting more growth, usually without success, by the way, because in any case, it's not that we know how to affect growth one way or the other. Macroeconomists, I don't speak on behalf of economists, but I think it's a fair reading of macroeconomists that they have concluded that they just don't know why economy grow or don't grow, just statistically. So it's not really something that is a good policy target, one way or the other. But what is what I will say, which might, agree, to some extent agree to what you say, that consumption patterns have to change. Energy consumption patterns have to change in rich countries if we have to make a dent. That's also my answer, along the line of the answer I gave to industrial policy. The current US target is to try to just live exactly in the same way, but in an electric fashion, and that's going to solve the problem. I find it extraordinarily unlikely that that would work. It would seem to me that it would create its own lot of problems, and so I think it's going to be very, very difficult to really tackle climate change without changing behavior and consumption behavior. And so that's in some sense the pessimistic. I'm techno-pessimist in that way. On the other hand, I'm people optimistic because I don't think it's that hard to have people change their behavior. So if you look, for example, at Europe, the carbon footprint of a European at the same level of income as an American is so much lower. And it's not that Europeans are more miserable. I don't know if you would call it degrowth, but people take the tram here in Switzerland, they take the train, they put sweater in the winter instead of putting their house very hot. They don't put sweater in the summer because they have too much air conditioning. So part of the consumption, energy consumption, isn't producing any welfare. So I think if we go back to the notion of what are we seeking? We're seeking kind of human welfare, being in good health, eating enough, going to school, realizing your dreams. And it's kind of an accident, and probably an unfortunate accident that it got tied in the way that countries calculate their performance scores with growth. So that's kind of my long answer on degrowth. On the reaching the marginalized community, I think this is if I had all this money, that's kind of one of the things that I would start doing. And in fact, even before COVID happened, I remember discussing what should be done now. And I think a very important set of steps to take is to build this financial infrastructure to make sure that everyone is within reach of one of these transfers, which, as you rightly point out, is not going to come automatically. Bangladesh, I don't know if that's the example, because in fact they missed a lot of people because they were trying to do that in the middle of COVID. But a good example is Togo. So Togo started, during COVID, they decided that they wanted to have a cash transfer available in the cities that they had to lock down. And within a matter of weeks, literally, they managed to put in place a system that was, having all the cell phone operators working together. You don't need a smartphone, you need a phone, not necessarily yours, but a phone that you can get an SMS on. They were able to build that very quickly, to implement their project very quickly, to have a cheap way of doing targeting using machine learning with satellite data and so on, plus the metadata of the cell phone use. I'm sure the system could be improved, but it already showed very good performance in comparison to traditional system of trying to get to every person one by one. So I think that type of things could really be done. The third question was about, just remind, say me one word, tell me one word. And sorry? Regionalization, yeah. So I have a paper on dams that was exactly what you're talking about. This is about India and showing that dams create a lot of inequality. In particular, anybody who is upstream from the dam is very screwed by having a dam. Because what they had before, so people who are upstream from the dam or in the common area that get flooded get totally, it's terrible for them. Meanwhile, there are a lot of gain further downstream as the irrigation is, most Indian dams are for irrigation. So that was very much highlighting these distributional issues around big infrastructure projects like dams. And in the world we have now, where there is not a ton of cooperation between countries, and in particular, we see that the moment there is a crisis, everyone kind of retracting in their own private bubble like we had during COVID and the vaccines. This is something that is probably not going to make it easier to get this, a sort of a rational energy grid for clean energy. So that's one of the obstacles that need to be overcome in this process.
I would actually maybe take two more questions, but very quickly, because we have abused of Esther's generosity here.
Yes, thank you so much for the clear and precise presentation, first of all. I'm following the negotiations on loss and damage quite closely, and you were talking about also about grants, and I was wondering, do you think, I mean, there's a big call from Global South countries to make the Loss and Damage Fund grant-based. Do you think we can do that? Do you think Global North countries will do that, or,
Okay, let's move to the next question, just to be quick.
Hi there, thanks so much for the lecture. My question would be concerned your proposition about the taxation of multinational corporations, and it would just be about how to establish that and address potentials for loopholes. How do you realize that international framework for taxing multinational corporations?
Got it.
Yeah, so both of your questions are slightly above my pay grade. I don't know what is possible in the COP negotiation. I'm not part of them. I find them obscure and hard to penetrate, so I don't know what they are going to come up with. Definitely, as I argued, I think loan-based for mitigation is just simply shouldn't even count as help. Loan-based for adaptation or recovery similarly. So I agree with the claim that I definitely agree that it should all be grants. But I don't know whether that's going to be possible or not. Having the money would help. I've thought a bit more on that international taxation. So it turns out that there is already a framework and there is already an agreement, and it's actually it's already been signed and is being implemented in all of the countries. So at an abstract level, my hope is one could piggyback to that process. What I realized in talking more concretely with people about it, I've given similar version of this talks to the IMF board, and they think it's great. But then when you move to people who are actually very familiar to the negotiation, there are a number of obstacles to it. In particular, the fact that today the way that the agreement is being implemented is countries put a minimum, but then they raise the money and they keep it. So in this instance, you will need to raise the money and then give it to someone else, and that's a different ball game altogether, legally, politically, and so on. There's also the minor trouble that the US hasn't signed really the 15% minimum. They were very much at its beginning, but they require Congress signature, and lately their Congress has been otherwise engaged. So they haven't come around to signing this, and I don't know if they will ever. But the other countries can do it. In fact, it could be done unilaterally by Europe. And then if it's done unilaterally by Europe, it would penalize the European firms. So you could compensate by taxing the difference in the form of tariffs at the entry to Europe. And that's not unheard of, because that's already what is done to compensate for the fact that the environmental regulations are different. So I don't think there is any obstacle that's unsurmountable, but of course, you would need a lot of momentum for something like that to happen. But you have to put things on the table and then hope that someone is going to pick them up.
Well, I guess this concludes it. Thank you so much, Esther. Thanks everyone for coming.